Hello everyone, this is your final preparation, very brief kind of overview to get you set up for your final, so hopefully you do extremely well on that last exam that you have for A&P, and then you can move on to greater things after A&P this year. That being said, wearing my Prefontaine shirt, Prefontaine being one of my kind of idols, if you will, from an athletic perspective. My little quote behind me gets us that shoulder, you can see as well. Very defining for me, for something to stay motivated by, and hopefully you can do well with this and be motivated to do well too. So I kept my shirt on rather than my nice collared shirt, which looks a little more like a professor, but I decided to go a little casual here because you're going to casually coast through this and do well. That's the hope. Okay, a quick overview for you. Let me know if you need anything between now and the exam or after the exam, either way. All right. First of all, so start with chapter 28 as we go over our reproductive portion of the final exam, which again is 50 questions out of your 100. It's on chapter 28 and 29, the content from there, and the other 50 again is your old exams. All the 4 or 5 past exams. Look at those questions. They should all be open. All those McGraw-Hill exams. Look over them once, twice, 3 times, as many as you need to till you have it, right? As you've learned by this point, this is all about repetitiveness in study and going over it in different ways, going over it, rewriting your notes, watching the videos, saying it out loud to yourself, do whatever you have to do to get this information down, okay? Do some concept maps. That said, for the common elements, the 2 systems are the female and male reproductive systems. For your exam, make sure that you note, of course, that the primary reproductive organs are the gonads, and of course they produce the sex cells called the gametes, and they produce large amounts of sex hormones. From a very general perspective, but know that. And a few slides I left in here just for your content purposes, but the content is specifically not necessarily in the exam, but maybe seeing that flow might help you in understanding and remembering the information. For hormones that initiate puberty, make sure you note that the hypothalamus begins to secrete gonadotropin releasing hormone, and of course it also stimulates anterior pituitary to release 2 hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and how the gonads begin to produce significant levels of sex hormones and starts the process of gamete and sexual maturation at puberty. As far as hereditary information, make sure you understand the diploid cell is 23 pairs of chromosomes, basically your 2 N chromosomes, and the haploid cell is 23 chromosomes, not 23 pairs. The chromosome number is N, and the gametes from either sex. A little more on that a little bit later. Make sure you know that content though. It also relates to, there's at least 2, 3, maybe even 4 questions relating to mitosis, meiosis, and the hereditary type questions. So make sure you have this information down, noting the difference between mitosis and meiosis here in this basic content from a standpoint of having to classify mitosis versus meiosis, and also just probably a multiple choice question or 2 as well. Okay, as well as fill in the blank. I think there's at least 1 question on that as well. So at least 2 or 3 questions on those concepts. And with meiosis, make sure you understand the details of the interphase portion, where the cell phases prior to meiosis, with DNA in each cell replicated, and how replicated chromosomes now are composed of 2 sister chromatids. There's at least a couple questions on sister chromatids, how they are the structures with identical copies of DNA, and they're attached at a specialized region at the centromere. Again, I encourage you to read the other information just to make sure you have the basic content down, but make sure you understand the highlighted information in particular. As always, trying to make it a little simpler for you, even though you should know all this stuff in general, right? You're supposed to know it. So going through a lot of content here, good stuff, but it can't all be in the exam. This specific diagram will be on your exam. Expect, again, anywhere between 4 to 6 aspects of this particular diagram with the posterior view of the female reproductive system. That diagram is on your exam. With the ovaries, make sure you note that they're immediately surrounded by, or the primary follicle is immediately surrounded. The primary oocyte is the zona pellucida. Make sure you know that. Actually, it's a multiple choice question for you right there. Gave it to you. With oogenesis, note that it's the maturation of a primary oocyte to secondary oocyte and occurs in stages over the life of a female. Okay, that one I believe is either multiple choice or fill in the blank. And you actually will need to know those different phases: follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase, but it's actually noted in a different slide, but you'll need to know that basic content. Here it is. This diagram right here, and you'll want to enlarge it and look at it. There are at least 3 or 4 questions that are going to be coming from the content you find in this diagram. The diagram itself is not on your exam. It is just a very all-inclusive type, basically diagram here. I think it's at least 4, it might even be 5 questions that relate to the content you have in this diagram. Know it well. And this one, the top and the bottom 2 diagrams are on your exam with ovulation, with the different phases of ovulation, and then and with a different hormone response, I should say, specifically, as well as with the menstrual versus proliferative versus the secretory phases in the female reproductive system, and noting the variations here, that those specific 2 diagrams are on your exam. With the ovarian cycle and its regulation, note that the corpus luteum secretes large amounts of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin, which inhibits the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary and builds the uterine lining. That's important. That's at least one multiple choice question, and I believe it fits into a fill in the blank type question at one point as well. The uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, make sure you note that's where they transport the ovulated oocyte to the uterus. It's also the site for fertilization in those fallopian tubes. Functions of the uterus, note that it's the implantation site for the preembryos, that it supports, protects, nourishes, and develops the embryo, and forms that vascular connection that develops into the placenta. That one, I believe, was also a fill in the blank with different terms. Make sure you note the different terms and or multiple choice on that. Some of these different structures will come back here for the uterus as well, noted in a little bit here. With the vagina, make sure you note these different areas of the vagina and its basic functions and anatomical structure, both. That was a either a fill in the blank or a category or a classification question there. This diagram is on your, actually, the diagram's not on your exam. This one was not the diagram that I want you to note. I want you to, you're going to have to, from a, it's not really a multiple choice question. Well, it kind of is. It's one of those questions where you have 3 or 4 different questions and you have to select the right one for each one. So you have to certainly note the uterine part versus the isthmus, the ampulla, infundibulum, basically the fundus as well, and the body of the uterus, specifically noting from when basically the pathway in general, so you kind of know location-wise from a multiple choice type question, specifically, not a diagram. So make sure you note that, okay? I believe that was the content you needed, you know, going down the uterine tube specifically, and the basic content that I just mentioned right there. As far as the menstrual cycle and menstruation, certainly note the basic details, almost all of them, with a few variations that I didn't note in there because it wasn't vital for your exam content. All that's good to know. For the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase is at least 2 or 3 questions on that content. From a anatomical structure standpoint, certainly want to note the labia majora is homologous, excuse me, to the scrotum in the male. The labia minora are the paired folds immediately internal to the labia majora. This one is another one of those questions whereby you have to match, essentially. They'll give you the content and match. And the clitoris is the small erectile body in the anterior region of the labia minora. And the prepuce is the hood over the clitoris, excuse me. The mammary gland components, make sure you note simple content. Again, kind of one of those classification, you got to pick the right one to match up with content. The nipple is the cylindrical projection in the center of the breast. The areola is the pigmented ring around the nipple with uneven surface due to sebaceous glands or areolar glands. That one I think was actually a fill in the blank, but it also was one of those where you may have to select kind of a matching type perspective. It also goes with lactiferous ducts as well with the mammary gland components, how they're the larger channels emerge ducts. They drain that single lobe, draining into the single lobe, and expands to form lactiferous sinus where milk is stored. Lactation, make sure you know the different components are what lactation essentially is, and of course the role of prolactin, oxytocin, and I believe there was more, maybe there wasn't, but certainly the roles of prolactin and oxytocin. That was another one of those fill in the blank type questions where they give you the terms, you got to fill it in. Make sure you know that all that content. There's at least 1, if not 2 questions on that. For the female sexual response, Note the different stages, starting with the excitement phase, orgasm, and the resolution phase. True of males as well. So it's really the stages of the sexual response in general. It's just noting the stages. You don't have to note the specific details of those stages for your exam. Obviously, you should know the primary reproductive organs of the male or the testes. Scrotum characteristics is at least one question related to that, noting that it's the skin-covered sac between the thighs, has a ridge-like seam at the midline, the raphe. And with decreased temperature, you have the contraction of the dartos muscle and the cremaster muscles. And this male pelvic region diagram is on your exam, so note you'll have 4 to 6 of those content areas you'll need to know. Don't know which ones, as always. Same with the testis here. 4 to 6 of those regions will be on your exam, and you should be able to, not from a diagram perspective, but you should be able to, in this diagram, we covered it actually in lab, but be able to state where sperm originates and in the pathway it travels to leave the body. You should be able to do that. It'll be from be both male and female. It'll be from the standpoint of the ovarian cycle for basically going into the fallopian tube. It'll also be there for male reproductive cycle from the standpoint of sperm to ejaculation, sperm production to ejaculation. So make sure that you can identify from a step-by-step process where it kind of goes, generally speaking, or at least enough to be able to categorize it when given the choices. From a standpoint of the testes and spermatogenesis, make sure you note that spermatogenesis is the process of sperm development, occurs within that seminiferous tubule. And spermatogonia is where the primordial germ cells from which all the sperm develop. And the diploid cells are near the base of the seminiferous tubule, and they divide by mitosis, right, at this point, into the new spermatogonium, I should say, and primary spermatocyte. And then the secondary spermatocytes are the 2 cells that are produced by primary spermatocyte from meiosis 1, and the haploid cells with 23 chromosomes only at this point. And then you get the spermatid that's formed when the secondary spermatocytes complete meiosis 2. That content you need to know. That'll be another one of those categorization or ordering type questions. You'll have at least one question that compares the male and the female in terms of gametogenesis or gametogenesis. Noting the difference between the number of oocytes versus number of sperm produced, how meiosis plays a role prior to birth, and how male spermatogonia start at puberty, and how the females only able to produce until menopause, but the males can produce throughout male's adult life. So you're comparing them, and you'll have to classify and place them in the right location. And again, this PowerPoint's in the same location and course announcements where you found this video. This image is on your exam for the duct system and accessory glands in the male reproductive tract. So prepare for 4 to 6 of those to be showing up on your exam. You'll have to identify. You should know this in general. Well, it's probably pretty obvious that you know that ejaculation is the end of orgasm for the in general. With that being said, you should also note for that it actually occurs due to sympathetic innervation. That's important, and I believe it's a multiple choice question on that. You'll have at least one question where you have to identify genetic versus phenotypic or phenotypic sex. So make sure you know the content here. Actually, there's a couple different questions on it. Actually, there was at least 2. One, I believe, was categorizing, and one may have been a multiple choice type format, so to speak, or matching. Okay, so make sure you have that down. At least 2 questions on that. From a puberty perspective, we actually noted it in a previous slide. It's basically the same information kind of noted here again. Make sure you note that with this basic content from puberty perspective, from the gland response and the hormones response and function, or at least from the general perspective. Again, there's probably at least a couple questions on that. Understanding that menopause is when the woman stops the monthly menstrual cycles for a full year. Typically, it should say typically, occurs between age 45 and 55. Could happen earlier. If someone's wanting, hopefully for their sake, it goes later if that's a desirable trait. That said, or need, I should say. False labor. False labor versus true labor. Make sure all the basic content here noted with false labor. So basically, it's either multiple choice or fill in the blank type questions, but make sure you have this content down. And with true labor, just noting it's basically not all the information you have to note here, but you should certainly note the contractions facilitate cervical dilation and expulsion of the fetus placenta. We'll come back to that content area here in a minute here. I believe I highlighted some other content you'll need to know. Here it is with true labor, the dilation stage. This basic content, make sure you note. It's at least a couple different questions on the stages of true labor, both in terms of classification with dilation versus expulsion, and then placental stage. And then at least one, I believe, is more fill in the blank. So at least a couple of questions. It may have been a third, at least two. And that is it. As I say, that's the 50 questions that are on your final for this first part, and the second part is the previous exams. I'm sure you'll do well. Want to see you do well. Let me know if you need anything. Best of everything to you. I've enjoyed our time together, even though most of it's been on Zoom most of the way through. Again, say it for the millionth time. Let me know if you need anything. Do well in whatever it is you do next. Take care.